The first time I encountered the work of Jacques Derrida was in an honors class that I was taking in college my junior year, and the teacher, whose name was Professor Kevin Newmark, he had assigned a small essay called On Forgiveness, which was written, it was kind of part of Derrida's late style, which was kind of very explicitly political and kind of always dialoguing on these global concepts of the new emerging world order, I guess, things like that. And the essay struck me as a very Christian sense of forgiveness and all this, and it fascinated me somewhat, but didn't really take to me, I think, too much as an exceptional piece of writing or as an exceptional writer. And that same semester, we were reading Maurice Blanchot's The Writing of the Disaster, which was a book that did strike me very much so. And it was kind of very difficult and very literary and enigmatic, and it kind of reminded me of Kafka and Pessoa, but there was something so gnarled and unfinished, or could never be finished maybe, about that particular text that really made me somewhat interested in these French writers that I had kind of dismissed wholesale for a very long time. So anyway, this was junior year, and I had seen this movie as part of the assignment in the class called Derrida, which was made by Amy Kaufman, and kind of was a very voyeuristic and somewhat lame attempt to kind of translate deconstruction into a biographical film, which you could clearly see Derrida had many reservations about and was trying to resist, but at the same time accepting, because I think he had reached a point in his life where it was important for him to let people make their own statements, let people make their own testimonies of what he was about. And his celebrity, I think, as much as it impaired him and made him such a controversial figure and kind of could obscure the work from being really looked at without the kind of hoopla of the hanger-ons, it also allowed him to kind of realize that if, I think, and as I speak for him, that if he had done anything, it would come to light, it would be seen, and perhaps this gave him more of a chance to kind of be accepting and practice and maybe enhance this lifelong obsession with the other, which, is something that as I would read Derrida and learn of its roots in Levinas and a whole body of other kind of literature than what I was used to when it came to philosophy, I would kind of figure more out about. But anyway, before any of that happened, so that class ended, and that was, Derrida kind of was put to the back of my mind. And I even remember kind of watching the film Derrida and kind of being taken by his charisma and his presence, which is of course a very charged word for postmodernism and deconstruction especially. But being taken by his presence on film and the way he was so kind of, you could tell how conscious he was of the many different things that were going on, and how this tension between whether or not he would kind of reveal what he was thinking was playing out in front of the lens, and it was kind of a very enjoyable tension, at least as a moviegoer, trained with, enjoyably plenty of B-movie, voyeuristic, MTV, VH1 kind of biopic 30-minute bits on different artists and things. But anyway, so that summer, I suffered a kind of a very serious traumatic experience, and I lost a friend who died. And the kind of mourning that immediately ensued became, I think, an obsession in all of my thinking, my writing, my reading. I was very interested to kind of see how writers were kind of marked by an event that completely changed them through the death of someone they loved. And so lo and behold, when I came back the fall of my senior year, and I had been reading Mallarmé and looking about to perhaps see, since I had heard that Derrida had written an essay on Mallarmé that was particularly fascinating and amazing. As I was in the library, the Tip O'Neill Library at Boston College where I went to school, I searched Derrida in the catalog, and one of the titles that came up was The Work of Mourning. And there was this kind of instinctive, yes, this is what I want. You know, this is the kind of book that I was meant to encounter and read. And I always have a superstitious eye when it comes to reading, because the books I read affect me so much, or have the potential to, that I like to think that there's kind of a book waiting for me to read. And I like to think that there's kind of a text that almost seems always to come after whatever you're experiencing, as if someone knew your life and they knew its events and they knew your struggles and they knew your interior thoughts and battles and whatnots, and they almost had written something accommodated, no matter how veiled or how cryptid, just about you. And which is of course very delusional, but you know, I think innocent and fair type of way to go about reading. You know, I mean, we want to pick up a book to learn something about how we think, even if that means challenging how we think. So anyway, I picked up the book, The Work of Mourning, and I remember, I think one of the first elegies, The Work of Mourning was a book that contains about 30 or so different, maybe not that many, but about maybe 24 different elegies for different colleagues that Derrida had known in different capacities, either as friends or just other, you know, thinkers. And they were these wonderfully elegant and moving and painful tributes that kind of existed right on the brink of what is possible to say and what is not possible to say. And they moved me very much. The more so because I really had no other context but a sense that the person who was writing the elegy, which was Derrida, was perhaps in the place that I was in my as a writer, wanting to be able to say something, yet being immediately astounded by the inability to encapsulate the experience of the death of someone you love. So one of the first ones I read, which is called In Memoriam of the Soul, it begins, "Forgive me for speaking in my own tongue. It's the only one I ever spoke with Paul de Man. It's also the one in which he often taught, wrote, and thought. What is more, I haven't the heart today to translate these few words, adding to them the suffering and distance for you and for me of a foreign accent. We are speaking today less in order to say something than to assure ourselves with voice and with music that we are together in the same thought. We know with what difficulty one finds right and decent words at such a moment, when no recourse should be had to common usage, since all conventions will seem either intolerable or vain." And later on he writes, "Speaking is impossible, but so too would be silence, or absence, or a refusal to share one's sadness. Let me simply ask you to forgive me if today finds me with the strength for only a very few simple words. So I was very moved, and the brevity, the unbelievable economy in which you would have to present and say something to summarize a person's life, and the meaning it had, and the different meanings it had, and the complexity of those human relationships in 2 pages. There was something that I was very taken by. So that was the kind of beginning of my experience of reading Jacques Derrida, which I'm sure is a very unusual beginning, since it's not really a very theoretical or philosophically proper approach into his large, extensive body of work. For someone who hadn't been trained in Heidegger or really read very much of Plato, of Aristotle, of Kant, of Hegel, of all the kind of major figures in Western thinking, Derrida was very exciting because he seemed to simultaneously give you a very classical and sophisticated approach to those texts and to the people that wish to kind of become their heirs, but also a very dynamic and revolutionary and nuanced and idiosyncratic way of reading, needless to say. And so this would kind of begin my sense of Derrida as always kind of being this elegist. And again, just the chance occurrence of this being the first book of his I read, which was published only a few years before his own death. And I believe, actually, I should check what year it was published, or at least translated and collected together. Yeah, in 2001. So this kind of always colored my perspective of Derrida as a very validly autobiographical and mourning writer. And the phrase, the work of mourning, which he appropriates from Freud, is a phrase that kind of comes out in his interviews and his texts pervasively. And I believe there's a way in which a lot of Derrida's refusal to think in the philosophical abstract mode of systems is kind of a choice of mourning, or maybe an allegiance to mourning, in the sense that I believe in every grief there's a stage where we refuse feeling better, we refuse tomorrow, the possibility that the world continues as it already is, and we linger with the kind of betrayal and sadness, both selfishly but also to extend a kind of a camaraderie with the person that has died, because there's a way in which they cannot move on, and they're kind of frozen in this past light. And so for me, especially Derrida's deconstruction of what he calls the metaphysics of presence, and the way that philosophy determines logos and being to be something where it is always the being present, or what Heidegger calls the ready-to-handness of being. There's a way in which Derrida's critique is less nihilistic than trying to kind of be scrupulous and honest, and kind of, I would imagine, in the wake of whatever personal griefs he had suffered, but also in the wake of continental philosophy after World War II, the experience of the Holocaust, and much of the 20th century, that there's a way in which Derrida was this great mind who kind of forced philosophy to kind of reckon with its own urge and desire to abstract, to pull away from, to be at a remove from mortality. And there's a way in which I believe that his obsession with ghosts and all of these kind of different themes that he weaves into his texts are linked very closely to an affinity and loyalty to be someone who mourns. And in that way, there is a cherishing and a meditation of presence that realizes how sacred it is, the time that we have, with the people we know. And also the way in which we are, he always says we are always already mourning, we're kind of always experiencing, anticipating our own deaths in many analogous ways. The relationship with the other, the relationship with God, the relationship with language, and trying to kind of improvise and come up with a signature anyway. So anyway, these are the kind of the things that kind of excited me into my interest with Derrida, and it would lead me to kind of read things obsessively, as I often do, like the double session in Dissemination, which is this tremendous piece of literary criticism and philosophical analysis that deals with Plato and Mallarmé and many other things. So, in my senior year in the second semester, I was able to work with Professor Newmark on an independent research class on Derrida, and I was never able to kind of write the essay I wanted to write. I think in part because I was a senior, I was graduating, I already had a thesis and a kind of course load to handle with. Secondly, because my understanding of Derrida still needed to be, and still needs to be, more articulated, more refined, because there's a way in which it can kind of be very hard to just keep all the things in one's mind that it requires, when you're kind of dealing with a diagnostic for 2,000 years of thinking. But also because I think there was a part of me that was resistant to write something that was so close to me, which is odd, because as a poet, elegies or the elegiac mode had often been very central to the way I write, and yet it's a very kind of instinctive choice. It's not something that I think about or kind of try and put together. The poems kind of almost seem to lead that way. More so, of course, after my experience in 2004. So I wish one day, though, to perhaps talk about the mourning, and perhaps maybe this is something that's really outside of simply Derrida, in terms of different places in literature that have kind of formed my own sense of it, either in Hamlet or in the ecstatic and somewhat medieval poetry of Emily Dickinson, but also in the sense that, it recalls the Old Testament, the way in which the lover is somehow already a ghost and somehow already not of this world. So but that's kind of how I started reading Derrida, and yeah.